Dalai 가서 다 연시사디 지 진주기 미 로마즈 지미기 타네 다디 연시시 고도스네 타셔요나 때 다가 타셔셔로다 경호군이 나름 문신 제조 대 자동만 나세신 연시 문신기 제그 경구소 달라라메 라장 간대포장 이시계회 이시계제 왕대 겐진 남의 여보다 셰수저 티슈 미소베 네오는 조가야 매버체지 군기.
The 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, is turning 90 on the 6th of July. Who will be Dalai Lama's successor and how does it matter to India? This video will explain the full context to you. But before that, I want to highlight for you two important dates just to jog your memory about how far back the story goes. This actually goes back to 1951 when China invaded Tibet. The PLA, the People's Liberation Army, invaded Tibet. In 1959, there was a people's uprising in Tibet against China, which was crushed by Chinese forces. That same year, in March 1959, is when Dalai Lama escaped to India through Arunachal Pradesh, and the then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru decided to set up the Dalai Lama in Ganj in Dharamshala, where he has been living ever since. The next important date is of 29th May 2011, when the Dalai Lama decided to relinquish his authority, the political part of it, retaining only the spiritual authority, and Tibet got a democratically elected leader living in exile again. So this entire Tibetan parliament operates in exile in India. Now the question is that there is a statement from Dalai Lama which said that when he is around 90, he will decide on who takes over as his successor. Let's get started with what happens now. The Dalai Lama has taken a decisive step to anchor his succession in Tibetan spiritual authority, ensuring continuity of leadership posthumously. Top intelligence sources say his statement preempts any Chinese propaganda or parallel installation efforts with Panchen Lama's appointment. The statement, sources say, also reflect a diplomatic win for India and Dharamshala. The Dalai Lama has clearly stated that the institution of the Dalai Lama will continue through his succession, reversing the ambiguity he maintained since 1969 about whether the lineage should persist. Now he confirms that the lineage will continue beyond his lifetime. Top intelligence sources emphasize that the Dalai Lama's statement neutralizes Beijing's narrative that the Dalai Lama's role is outdated or that his successor can be controlled through state machinery. It creates a shield around his reincarnation, rooted in tradition and institutional legitimacy, making any future Chinese-appointed Dalai Lama appear inauthentic. Intelligence sources also note that the inclusion of consultations with Mongolian, Russian, Himalayan, and Chinese Buddhist communities internationalizes the selection process and signals broad legitimacy. Operationally, it empowers the exile apparatus, including the Garden Phodrang and the Central Tibetan Administration, to begin preparing succession mechanisms discreetly before his passing. Intelligence sources reveal a significant setback for China and a gain for India, as the Dalai Lama's recent speech directly challenges Beijing's long-term Tibet strategy. According to sources, the Dalai Lama's clarification of his spiritual succession mechanism represents a substantial strategic blow to China. By declaring that only the Garden Phodrang Trust will oversee his reincarnation, the Dalai Lama has now completely invalidated any future Chinese government attempts to appoint a quote-unquote Dalai Lama successor.
Dalai 가서 다 연시사디 지 진주기 미 로마즈 지미기 타네 다디 영시시 고도스네 타셔요나 때 다가 타셔셔로다 경호군이 나름 문신 제조 대 자동만 나세신 영시 문신기 제그 Gengurso Dalai Lama Lajang Gandep Hojang Yiji Gewe Yiji Geze Wangden Genzin Namla Yobadang Shen Sujang Tishu Mishogwe Nevo Len Jo Gaya Meba Cheji Gunji.
Intelligence sources highlight that such an appointment, if made by China, would lack political and spiritual legitimacy and will only be perceived as fraudulent globally. Sources also note that Beijing's efforts to use soft power in Tibet have been undermined. Chinese investment in the Panchen Lama has been rendered futile by the Dalai Lama's statement, which has presented him as a progressive, consultative leader deeply rooted in traditional Buddhist authority. Further reports suggest that with the Garden Phodrang Trust operating under Indian protection in Dharamshala, the recognition locus of the next Dalai Lama and the seat of Tibetan spiritual legitimacy are now firmly established on Indian soil. This development showcases India's soft power throughout the Buddhist world. Nations with substantial Buddhist populations, including Mongolia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Japan, Bhutan, and Vietnam, are now more inclined to seek moral and spiritual leadership in Buddhism from India rather than China. Sources point out that India, by providing asylum to the Dalai Lama and upholding religious freedom, exemplifies its liberal and democratic values. Conversely, China's authoritarian control over religion and attempts to manipulate reincarnation processes reveal its repressive regime image. Intelligence sources also indicate that an India-backed succession will possess greater spiritual authority, especially among Himalayan Buddhist communities in regions like Ladakh, Sikkim, Arunachal Pradesh, and Tawang, neutralizing Chinese attempts to assert influence in these areas. It is also believed that Dalai Lama's statement aligns with internal Tibetan sentiment, indicating that decades of Chinese repression have failed to extinguish Tibetan faith or loyalty. This represents a defeat for the Communist Party and subtly reinforces India's Tibet policy. The Dalai Lama's announcement has profound spiritual significance, offering an opportunity to shape the future of Buddhist diplomacy and Tibetan identity from Dharamshala rather than Lhasa. The Garden Phodrang Trust, which is the private office of Dalai Lama, has been given exclusive authority to identify and authenticate his successor, effectively delegitimizing any Chinese state-backed attempts to install a rival reincarnation. No external actor, political or religious, can interfere in this process, as per the statement. The defined procedure of recognition involves consultations with high Tibetan lamas and references to dharma protectors, spiritual entities tied to the Dalai Lama lineage. The process rejects any claims by China or unauthorized actors, ensuring the continuity with a pan-Buddhist exile-led spiritual framework. So what did the Dalai Lama say on his succession? The Dalai Lama has made it clear that only the Garden Phodrang Trust, the office of His Holiness, holds the sole authority to recognize his future reincarnation. The statement says, and I quote, "The process by which a future Dalai Lama is to be recognized has been clearly established in the 24th September 2011 statement, which states that responsibility for doing so will rest exclusively with the members of the Garden Phodrang Trust, the office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. They should consult the various heads of the Tibetan Buddhist traditions and the reliable oath-bound dharma protectors who are linked inseparably to the lineage of the Dalai Lamas. They should accordingly carry out the procedures of search and recognition in accordance with past tradition." Unquote. Dalai Lama further says in the statement, and I quote, "I hereby reiterate that the Garden Phodrang Trust has sole authority to recognize the future reincarnation. No one else has any such authority to interfere in this matter." Thanks for watching this video. Do like and subscribe and put in your comments telling us what you think of this issue and if there is anything in particular that you would like to highlight about what you found interesting about this video. Thanks for watching.